Welcome to our latest exploration into the source material. Today, our mission is to dive into something pretty heavy, the rules of war.
Right, what we call International Humanitarian Law, or IHL.
Yeah, IHL. We're tracing its evolution from the ashes of World War II all the way to, the digital battlefields of tomorrow.
It is a massive shift. I mean, think about the baseline.
Imagine you're a soldier in 1944. If your commander orders you to commit an atrocity, your main defense is basically, hey, I'm just a cog in the state machine.
But by 1945, that machine was dismantled. You look at the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, they revolutionized justice.
They didn't just punish the losing side. They completely shattered that idea that following orders was a total shield.
Exactly. For the first time, individual responsibility was front and center. You were held legally accountable regardless of what your government told you to do.
And that shift is really the soul of IHL, which sets the stage for the 1949 Geneva Conventions.
The absolute bedrock of how we try to contain the horrors of conflict, because before 49, the focus was mostly on soldiers. But after seeing the devastation of the Second World War, the world realized that civilians in occupied territories needed explicit, enforceable legal protections.
And it wasn't just about massive international wars either. You have to look at Common Article 3.
The mini-convention.
The mini-convention, exactly. It's this tiny piece of text, but it carries massive weight. It was the first time fundamental rights were applied to internal civil wars.
Suddenly, even in a domestic rebellion, there was a baseline of humanity that you just couldn't cross.
But then, as the 20th century progressed, the way we fought started to change. It looked less like two armies on a field and more like the asymmetric conflicts of decolonization.
Yeah, by the 50s and 70s, the old rules were really struggling to keep up with guerrilla warfare.
Which is why the 1977 additional protocols were such a milestone.
They merged the Law of Geneva, which is all about protecting people, with the Law of Hague.
And the Law of Hague is where things get very practical and frankly a bit grim. It's the how of fighting.
Right, it dictates conduct.
It's why you can't use certain ammunition, like hollow-point bullets that expand inside the body, because they cause superfluous injury.
The 1977 update basically said, even if you are fighting for national liberation and you aren't a traditional army in a uniform, you are still bound by these rules.
It's about banning the tools of suffering. You see this moving into the 80s and 90s with the 1980 Framework on Conventional Weapons and the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention.
But the real landmark moment for many was the 1997 Ottawa Treaty.
That was the landmine ban.
Exactly. And it didn't just come from high-level diplomats. It was a massive push from civil society. They closed a huge loophole by arguing that anti-personnel landmines are inherently incapable of distinguishing between a soldier's boot and a child's foot.
Of course, all these rules only matter if there's an umpire watching the game.
Which brings us to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, established by the 1998 Rome Statute.
Though we need to clarify the principle of complementarity here, the ICC isn't a global police force replacing local courts.
No, it's a court of last resort. It only steps in when a nation is genuinely unable or unwilling to prosecute its own.
It's a safety net. And we saw that kind of accountability taking shape in the 90s with the ad hoc tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia.
Those courts did something profound. They redefined sexual violence in the eyes of the law.
It was no longer just viewed as a tragic byproduct of chaos.
Right, it became legally recognized as a weapon of war, a crime against humanity.
But then we hit the post-9/11 world. And the war on terror really threw a wrench in the works.
It did. When you are dealing with non-state actors who don't wear uniforms and operate across borders, that neat binary of civilian versus combatant gets very thin.
It forces you to wonder if a framework built on 1940s logic can hold up against 21st century shadow wars, or digital warfare for that matter.
That is the modern frontier. We are moving from physical trenches to digital code.
If a cyber attack shuts down a city's power grid and hospitals lose backup generators, is that a war crime under IHL?
The consensus leans toward yes, but enforcing it is a nightmare. And speaking of high-tech threats, look at the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Officially declaring them inherently indiscriminate.
Exactly. The law is trying to put a keep-out sign on the most destructive tech we have.
But maybe the most haunting development is autonomous weapons, the killer robots. We are talking about systems that can select and engage targets without a human pulling the trigger.
And IHL is based on the principle of humanity, which requires empathy and judgment. Can you program that into an algorithm?
We've gone from holding individuals responsible at Nuremberg to wondering who is responsible when the individual is a line of code.
We are entering an era where humans might be removed from the loop entirely.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for everyone listening to this exploration. We've seen IHL shift from regulating state battles to protecting us from high-tech threats. But if we eventually hand over the life and death decisions of the battlefield to autonomous systems, can a legal framework built entirely on human empathy ever truly govern a machine that feels nothing?
War and rules. You know, those two words, they just don't feel like they belong in the same sentence, do they? I mean, war is the definition of chaos, of destruction, the complete breakdown of order. And rules? Well, they're the exact opposite. So how on earth did we ever get to a point where we tried to create a rule book for our most brutal, most chaotic activity? Well, that's what we're going to get into today. Let's unpack the story of how humanity tried to civilize its most uncivilized act. I mean, it really is the fundamental question, isn't it? When everything falls apart, when armies are clashing, are there any lines that just can't be crossed? The answer, which might surprise you and is maybe a little fragile, is yes, there are. And here's the thing. We're not talking about ancient history here. This whole story really kicks off in the last 75 years or so. Our modern rules of war, they were forged in the fire and rubble of the single most destructive conflict humanity has ever known, World War II. So really, this is a story about us trying to learn from our absolute worst mistakes. Okay, so to really get a handle on the rules we have today, we've got to go back to 1945. The world was just staggering out of the Second World War, looking around at this unbelievable devastation, and there was this collective feeling, this global decision that never again. This can't happen again. See, the thing is, it's not like there were no rules before the war. There were, but they were from 1929, and they were designed for a totally different kind of conflict. You know, soldiers fighting soldiers on a battlefield. They had absolutely no answer for the Blitz, for concentration camps, for the bombing of entire cities. The old system didn't just bend. It completely broke. It was useless.
So, facing this total failure, the international community came up with a two-part solution. First, and this was huge, they said, okay, from now on, individuals can be held responsible. Not just faceless governments, but actual people. That was the whole idea behind the famous Nuremberg and Tokyo trials. And second, they knew the old rule book was toast. They had to start from scratch.
And this is what led to the single most important development in this entire story, the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Now, if you look here, you'll see the four main conventions. The first three were basically updates. Rules for wounded soldiers on land, at sea, prisoners of war. But that fourth one, that was a game changer. For the very first time, there was an international treaty designed just to protect civilians. I mean, think about that shift. It went from just regulating how soldiers fight to protecting the dignity of every human being caught in the middle.
And they didn't even stop there. The architects of these conventions went one step further. Tucked away inside all four of those documents is something called Common Article 3. And this was a real breakthrough. Basically, it's a mini-convention that says even in a civil war, a conflict inside a single country, these basic protections for humane treatment still apply. This was a massive deal, taking the law into places it had never, ever been before.
But of course, the world doesn't stand still, right? The ink was barely dry on the 1949 conventions when the very nature of war started to shift again. We're now entering the era of decolonization, of guerrilla conflicts, and these new kinds of wars brought a whole new set of problems that those shiny new rules just weren't designed to handle.
And this really became the core problem. What do you do when the fighters don't wear a uniform? When they blend in with everyone else? When the battlefield isn't some open field, but a village or a city or a dense jungle? All of a sudden, that fundamental rule, the principle of distinction, which was all about telling combatants and civilians apart, became almost impossible. And the 1949 rules, they didn't really have a good answer.
So once again, the law had to adapt. It had to catch up to reality. As you can see on this timeline in 1977, we get two additional protocols. These were created specifically to deal with these new kinds of conflicts, things like civil wars and guerrilla warfare, drawing on the lessons from places like Vietnam. Then, fast forward to 1997, and something new happens. It's not just governments anymore. A global movement, led by regular people and organizations, successfully pushed for the Ottawa Treaty, which completely banned anti-personnel landmines. A huge moment.
Now, those 1977 protocols did something else that was really, really important. For a long time, you had these two different streams of law. Think of them as two rivers. You had Geneva law, which was all about protecting people, civilians, POWs, the wounded, and then you had Hague law, which was about limiting the how of war, the weapons and tactics you could use. What the protocols did was basically merge those two rivers into one big, powerful one. It created a much more complete and comprehensive rulebook.
All right, so let's fast forward to the 1990s. The rule book is getting pretty sophisticated, but a huge gaping problem was becoming more and more obvious. It's great to have rules, but what happens when people break them? Who's the referee? Who holds them accountable?
The hard truth was, for almost half a century, there was no referee, no permanent global cop on the beat. And this massive justice gap became horribly, tragically clear in the 1990s with the genocides in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. The world was watching these unspeakable atrocities happen, and it really felt like all these rules, they were just words on paper.
And so, in a pattern we've seen before, the world responded to tragedy with action. The first step was creating temporary or ad hoc tribunals just for the conflicts in the Balkans and Rwanda. These were like test runs, and they laid the groundwork for the next, much bigger step, establishing a permanent court, the International Criminal Court, or ICC, which officially came into being in 2002.
Okay, so how did these two things fit together? The easiest way to think about it is like a sport. International Humanitarian Law, or IHL, that's the official rule book. It sets out the rules of the game for states and defines what counts as a foul, or in this case, a war crime. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, that's the umpire. Its job isn't to write the rules, but to call out the individual players who break them and hold them accountable.
Okay, let's bring it all the way up to today, because this entire legal framework built up over decades is now facing tests that the people in 1949 could never have even imagined. We're talking about new technologies and new ways of fighting that are pushing these old rules to their absolute limit.
Just think about the questions we're dealing with right now. The war on terror forced us to ask how the rules apply to groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, which aren't countries. More and more wars are fought in dense cities, so how do you protect civilians? Then you've got the digital world. Can a cyber attack be a war crime? And maybe the scariest of all, autonomous weapons, actual killer robots. Should a machine ever be allowed to make the decision to kill a human?
Let's stick with that cyber question for a second, because it really gets to the core of the problem. Can a rule that was written for cannons and rifles apply to a line of code? What if a cyber attack doesn't blow anything up, but it shuts down a hospital's power grid? It doesn't fire a single shot, but it could be just as deadly. How do you deal with that?
And when it comes to those autonomous weapons, the question gets even deeper, more ethical. This quote here really nails it. At its heart, the law of war requires human judgment. It requires people to make these incredibly difficult subjective calls about things like proportionality and humanity. So the real question is, can you ever actually program a machine to make that kind of moral judgment?
So, where does all this leave us? Well, it leaves us in the middle of a story that is far from over. This whole evolution of the rules of war didn't just stop in 1949 or 77 or 2002. No way. It's happening as we speak.
Look, if there's one big takeaway from all of this, it should be this. International humanitarian law is not some dusty old book sitting on a shelf. It's a living, breathing set of ideas. And every new conflict, every new technology forces us to argue about it, to reinterpret it, and ultimately to defend what it stands for.
And that brings us to the final, lingering question. For more than 75 years now, we've been building this thing, piece by piece, usually after something terrible has happened. And even though technology is moving at lightning speed, the basic challenge hasn't changed one bit. It's still about the constant, incredibly difficult work of drawing a line in the sand. A line that is supposed to protect our humanity, right at the moment when we are at our most inhuman.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that, honestly, when I first looked at the stack of research you sent over, it felt like a complete contradiction in terms.
Oh, yeah. It really does sound impossible on the face of
it. It feels like an oxymoron. We are talking about the rules of war.
Right. Because we're trying to impose order and law and, well, even a sense of humanity on what is arguably the most chaotic.
The most violent.
Exactly. The most violent and inhumane activity human beings engage in.
Right. I mean, war is violence. It is destruction by definition.
Yeah.
And yet, looking through the stack, and for you listening at home, we have a massive stack today. We've got historical accounts of the Geneva Conventions. We have legal frameworks from the International Criminal Court.
The ICC, yeah.
Right, the ICC.
Yeah.
And reports from the Red Cross. So there is this massive, dense ecosystem out there claiming that there is actually a right way to wage war.
And crucially, a wrong way.
Right, a wrong way. A wrong way that can, land you in prison or worse. So the mission today is to really understand that journey.
The evolution of it all.
Exactly. We're looking at International Humanitarian Law, or IHL.
Yeah.
And before you tune out thinking this is just dusty old history books or boring legal jargon,
It is definitely not that.
it's not abstract at all. This is a living, breathing framework that is currently, right now, struggling to figure out how to handle everything from cyber attacks to killer robots.
That is the key right there. It's an evolution. It's the story of the world moving from a mindset of anything goes to this really complex system of accountability.
Yeah.
It's basically about the tension between military necessity to, doing what you actually need to do to win the battle, and humanitarian principles, preserving basic human dignity even in the middle of absolute slaughter.
What really fascinates me looking at these sources is the shift in responsibility. Because it used to be that nations were responsible.
Mostly, yes.
Like, if a war crime happened, we blamed Germany or Japan or the state itself. But now, it's individuals. You specifically can be held responsible.
That is the single biggest shift in the last century.
Yeah.
Hands down. But to understand how we got there, and to see if these laws can actually keep up with AI and cyber warfare today, we have to go back to the beginning.
The foundation.
Or rather, the big bang of modern IHL.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're starting the post-war era, the foundation, roughly 1945 to 1949.
Setting the scene here is so crucial. You really have to put yourself in the mindset of 1945.
Right.
The world is just absolutely reeling. World War II has just ended, and the scale of the atrocities is something humanity had literally never seen before.
Never.
We aren't just talking about soldiers dying on a battlefield anymore.
No, we're talking about the Holocaust.
The Holocaust, the systematic targeting of civilians, the total firebombing of entire cities.
And the laws that existed before all this, I saw references in the sources to the 1929 conventions. They clearly didn't work.
Yeah.
They failed to prevent, almost everything.
They were completely insufficient. They were built for a totally different kind of war, a gentleman's war, if you can even call it that.
Between uniformed armies out in a field.
Exactly. You just collapsed under the sheer weight of total war.
Oh.
So the international community realized they had to do something drastic. And it started in a courtroom.
The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials.
Right.
And this is that shift you mentioned earlier. Because before this, if a war crime was committed, it was basically just a diplomatic issue.
Yeah, it was your country did this to my country, state versus state.
But at Nuremberg and Tokyo, the prosecutors did something completely revolutionary. They put the individuals in the dock.
Generals, politicians, industrial leaders.
Yeah.
They established a precedent that individuals could be criminally responsible for 3 specific things: war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity.
And that old defense of, I was just following orders that didn't fly anymore.
It was no longer a total defense. That is
Wow.
the critical takeaway for you to remember here.
Yeah.
You couldn't just hide behind the state apparatus anymore.
Wow.
The judges effectively said that international law imposes duties and liabilities upon individuals as well as upon states,
So if you committed a crime against humanity, you were liable.
regardless of what your commanding officer told you to do. That legal precedent set the stage for absolutely everything that came after it.
Okay, so Nuremberg sets the legal tone. It puts the fear of God, or at least the fear of a prison cell, into the leadership.
Yeah.
Then a few years later, in 1949, everyone gathers to actually write the new rules. This is the bedrock, right? The Geneva Conventions.
The 1949 Geneva Conventions. Now, people often say the Geneva Conventions singular.
Well, there's just one giant document.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But it's actually 4 distinct conventions.
Let's break them down then, because I think most people know they exist, but not exactly who they protect. I always just assumed they were entirely about prisoners of war.
That's a huge part of it, definitely, but it's much broader. The first 3 were basically updates to existing ideas,
Right.
but they made them much, much stronger.
Okay.
So Convention 1 protects wounded and 6 soldiers on land. So if you're shot and out of the fight or to combat is the legal term,
Yeah.
you cannot be targeted. You are no longer a threat.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough. Don't kick a man when he's down, basically.
Precisely. Now, Convention 2 is the exact same idea, but for war at sea.
So wounded, sick, and shipwrecked sailors.
Yes, it deals with hospital ships and ensuring sailors aren't just left to drown in the ocean.
Makes sense.
Then Convention 3 covers prisoners of war, or POWs. This details exactly how they must be treated. Housing, food, obviously not being tortured.
They have a right to send correspondence home, right?
They do, and this was a direct response to the horrific, just brutal treatment of POWs in the Pacific Theater and on the Eastern Front during World War II.
Right. But it's the fourth convention that I really want to spend a moment on because the research stack calls this one a literal game changer. Why is that?
Oh, absolutely. The Fourth Convention was completely revolutionary. For the first time ever, international law specifically protected civilians in occupied territories.
Because in World War II, if you were a civilian in occupied France or Poland, you were essentially at the total mercy of the occupiers, right? There was no legal shield at all.
Correct. You had very few rights, if any. The Nazis, for example, they took hostages, they deported entire populations for forced labor, and they engaged in massive collective punishment.
Just horrific stuff.
The Fourth Convention finally said, no more. It created concrete legal obligations for the occupying power to protect the civilian population. They had to ensure they had food and medical supplies, and it strictly prohibited deportation.
That was a massive leap forward in humanitarian thinking.
Huge. But there's this other thing in the 1949 text.
Oh, Common Article 3.
Yes.
It sounds like a footnote just based on the name, but the research highlights it as a major breakthrough.
It is maybe the most important paragraph in the entire stack of sources we have today. Common just means it appears in all four of the conventions we just listed.
Right.
But its actual content was the real aha moment for international law.
Why? What did it actually do?
Up until 1949, all these rules we've been talking about, they only applied to wars between countries, interstate wars. If a government wanted to slaughter its own people in a civil war, international law was largely completely silent. It was considered an internal matter. Sovereignty was king.
Yikes. So if a government turned its own army on its own citizens, Geneva didn't apply.
Exactly. Common Article 3 changed that entirely. It was the very first time IHL regulated non-international armed conflicts.
Which is basically legal speak for civil wars.
Yes.
So it's almost like a mini convention tucked inside the main convention.
That's the perfect analogy. It's a mini convention of fundamental rights. No torture, no execution without a fair trial. Basic humane treatment. And it applies even when the war is internal, not between two sovereign states.
That is huge.
It pierced that veil of national sovereignty for the sake of basic humanity. It finally said, look, there are some things you cannot do, even to your own people.
Okay, so we're at 1949. We have the rules. Civilians are protected. POWs are protected. Civil wars have a baseline of humanity. We did it. Mission accomplished. Right.
If only. Because almost as soon as the ink was dry on those treaties, the world completely changed again.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me. We move into the second era in our deep dive. Decolonization and the gray zone, spanning the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yes.
The Cold War is heating up, and the old colonial empires are collapsing.
Right. So we move away from those World War II-style conventional armies. The tanks, the clear front lines, the clearly marked uniforms. We move into the era of decolonization and this incredibly murky gray zone.
The sources call this the guerrilla problem.
Think about the wars of national liberation going on at this time. Vietnam, Algeria, various parts of Africa. The combatants weren't marching in bright uniforms on a clear, open battlefield.
No, they were mingling with the civilians. They were hiding out in jungles and in local villages.
Exactly. And the 1949 rules, brilliant as they were designed for uniformed armies. They really struggled to deal with guerrilla warfare.
I can imagine.
Because how do you distinguish between a combatant and a civilian when the combatant hides his weapon and looks exactly like a normal farmer during the day?
But then picks up a rifle at night.
Precise.
So there was a massive gap in the law here. The state soldiers fighting the guerrillas felt like they were fighting ghosts. And the guerrillas felt like if they put on uniforms, they'd just be instantly wiped out by superior firepower.
A huge gap. The reciprocity of the law basically broke down, you treat my guys well, I treat your guys well. That fell apart.
Before we get to how they fixed that, I do want to mention the 1954 Hague Convention that popped up in the sources.
Ah, yes.
That was the one specifically about cultural property, right?
Yes. It was prompted by the massive, tragic destruction of heritage and art during World War II. It was the very first treaty dedicated solely to protecting cultural property during a war. Monuments, art, historical sites.
Which makes sense. It recognized that destroying a people's culture is essentially a form of erasing them from history.
Exactly. It's incredibly important. But as you were hinting at, it didn't solve the guerrilla problem at all.
No. For that, we had to wait all the way until 1977, the additional protocols.
Yes.
The way the sources describe them, these sound almost like software updates, like Geneva 2.0.
In a way, they really were. They were necessary patches to the 1949 system. We got Protocol 1 and Protocol 2.
Let's start with Protocol 1. What did that patch actually fix?
I did two massive things. First, it merged Geneva law, which is primarily about protecting victims, with Hague law, which is about how you actually conduct the fighting, the targeting, and the weapons used.
Merging the protection aspect with the conduct of hostility?
Exactly. It introduced very strict rules on targeting, and, crucially, it codified this concept of proportionality.
Proportionality. Okay.
You cannot launch an attack if the expected civilian harm is excessive compared to the direct military advantage you anticipate gaining.
That is a very subjective line, though, isn't it?
Extremely.
I mean, excessive. Who defines excessive in the middle of a firefight?
It is entirely subjective, and it's the source of endless legal debate even today. Is killing one civilian to take out a high-ranking enemy general excessive?
Most militaries would say no.
Probably not under the strict letter of the law. But is killing 500 civilians to get one low-level sniper excessive?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But that middle ground, very murky.
Yeah.
Protocol, I also had a huge political dimension to it. It actually classified wars of national liberation. So, rebels fighting colonial powers as international conflicts.
Oh, wow. That is huge. That gave those rebel groups the exact same legal status as state soldiers.
It tried to, yes. It legitimized their struggle in the eyes of international law, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly controversial for established state powers at the time.
I bet. And then you had Protocol 2.
Right. Protocol 2 expanded protections specifically for victims of civil wars.
Yeah.
Basically beefing up that common Article 3 we talked about earlier.
Okay, so by 1977, we have rules for rebels, rules for civil wars, and rules for targeting.
We're making progress.
We are. But then humanity found entirely new ways to be cruel to each other.
Sadly, yes. Which brings us to the next phase, banning the indiscriminate, the 1980s and 90s.
The logic here in the source material is fascinating to me. The idea is that some weapons are just too cruel, they are so horrific, that they just have absolutely no place, even in the context of war.
Or that they are fundamentally indiscriminate, meaning, by their very nature, you cannot aim them at a soldier without also hitting a child nearby. You simply can't control who they hurt.
The first one on the list here is the 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or the CCW.
This was a framework treaty, and it banned some truly terrible things, like non-detectable fragments.
Non-detectable fragments.
Yes. Plastic shrapnel.
Plastic.
Fragments that X-rays simply cannot find in the human body.
Wow. That is just diabolical. Why would you even invent that in the first place?
To make treating the wounded completely impossible. If the field surgeon can't find the shrapnel, the soldier suffers immensely and inevitably dies of infection.
That's horrifying.
The international community looked at that and collectively said no. That serves absolutely no military purpose whatsoever other than the pure cruelty. So they banned it. They also banned blinding laser weapons under that same framework. Weapons designed specifically to permanently burn out the retinas and blind enemy soldiers.
Unbelievable. And then came the chemical weapons ban a bit later, right? In 1993.
The Chemical Weapons Convention. And this one was totally comprehensive. It didn't just ban using them on the battlefield. It strictly prohibited the development, the production, and the stockpiling of chemical weapons entirely.
And didn't it require countries to destroy what they already had?
It did. It mandated the complete destruction of all existing stockpiles.
But the really big story here, the one that really captures the imagination and the research, is the 1997 Ottawa Treaty, the total ban on landmines.
This is a truly remarkable story because of how it happened.
Yeah.
Usually, these massive treaties, they're negotiated by generals and diplomats behind closed doors in Geneva or The Hague. But the Ottawa Treaty was driven almost entirely by civil society.
The international campaign to ban landmines.
Exactly. It was NGOs, activists, immense public pressure. You had Princess Diana walking through the cleared minefields on television.
Right. I remember those images.
They powerfully argued that anti-personnel mines have a devastating long-term impact. The war ends, the armies sign a peace treaty, the soldiers go home. But the mines, they stay in the ground.
Just waiting for a child to step on them 10 or 20 years later.
Precisely. They are the ultimate indiscriminate weapon. because they act continuously, long after the military necessity is passed.
And the public pressure actually worked.
It really did. It proved that moral outrage, when it's channeled effectively through civil society, could actually force massive military powers to give up a weapon they found tactically useful.
It was a massive victory for humanitarianism over mere military utility.
It was a watershed moment.
So we have the foundation rules from 1949, we have the updates for guerrillas in 1977, and now we have these bans on specific nasty weapons in the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
But rules are useless if no one ever gets punished for breaking them.
That is the eternal problem of international law, enforcement. Without a cop on the highway, the speed limit is just a polite suggestion.
Which leads us perfectly into the age of accountability, the 1990s and 2000s.
This era, unfortunately, was born out of profound tragedy.
Yeah.
We're talking about the genocides in the Balkans during the violent breakup of Yugoslavia and in Rwanda.
Yeah.
The world watched horrors unfold that we genuinely thought we had left behind in the 1940s. Concentration camps, brutal ethnic cleansing, mass executions on television.
And the world eventually responded with the ad hoc tribunals, the ICTY for Yugoslavia and the ICTR for Rwanda.
Right. Now, these were temporary courts set up specifically by the UN Security Council for those conflicts. But their legal impact was permanent.
How so?
They greatly clarified the legal definitions of genocide. And, critically, they formally recognized sexual violence as a weapon of war.
That seems like a massive overdue step. Acknowledging that mass rape wasn't just some tragic side effect of soldiers misbehaving, but a calculated, deliberate strategy.
Exactly. It was a strategy of terror, a strategy of displacing populations and intentionally destroying the social fabric of the enemy. The tribunals successfully prosecuted it as a crime against humanity and even as a constituent act of genocide. It finally validated the suffering of thousands of women who had previously just been ignored by the history books and the legal systems.
But these tribunals, the ICTY and ICTR, they were temporary. We needed something permanent if this was going to be a real system.
Enter the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
Which was created by the Rome Statute in 1998 and actually opened its doors in 2002.
This is the first permanent international court designed to prosecute individuals, and again, notice we are back to individual accountability here, for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and eventually the crime of aggression.
But there's a concept here in the sources that I think really confuses people, complementarity.
Yes.
It sounds like giving someone a compliment, but it's a very specific legal term.
It's probably the most misunderstood part of how the ICC operates.
Yeah.
The ICC is designed strictly as a court of last resort. It does not exist to replace national courts.
So if a country prosecutes its own war criminals effectively, the ICC just stays out of it.
It's exactly right. The ICC only steps in when a sovereign country is deemed unwilling or unable to genuinely prosecute its own citizens.
So it's a safety net.
Yes. It respects national sovereignty first, but it essentially says, if you won't do justice yourself, we will step in and do it for you.
I really like the analogy from the source material here. It said IHL sets the rules of the game, and the ICC is the umpire that punishes the rule breakers.
That's a very good way to look at it. But to extend the metaphor, the umpire only steps onto the field if the team's own coach absolutely refuses to bench the player who is openly breaking the rules.
Got it. Now, before we leave this era of accountability, there's one more key document mentioned in the stack, the 2005 Customary International Law Study by the ICRC.
This one is vital for the legal nerds out there, but it really matters for everyone. The ICRC, the Red Cross, spent years meticulously studying what states actually do in war. Their real-world practice, not just what treaties they sign.
Why does that matter so much?
Because not every country has signed every single treaty. But customary law consists of rules that have become so widely accepted in practice that they legally bind all states, whether they signed a specific piece of paper or not.
Ah. So you can't just say, well, my country didn't sign Protocol 2, so I am legally allowed to target civilians in this civil war.
Exactly. The customary law study basically filled in all the remaining gaps and said, look, these are the universal baselines of human conduct, no exceptions, no excuses. It hardened the soft spots in the international legal framework.
Okay, so we have a pretty robust system now. We have permanent courts, we have comprehensive laws, we have customary baselines.
We do.
And then September 11th, 2001 happened.
The post-9/11 paradigm shift.
The global war on terror. This event just completely challenged everything we thought we knew about the binary nature of war, didn't it?
Completely. Because for centuries, IHL operated on a strict binary. You're either a civilian or you were a combatant,
Yeah.
a soldier or a non-soldier.
Very clean line.
Very clean. You are allowed to shoot one, and you are legally obligated to protect the other.
But what exactly is an al-Qaeda operative in that framework?
That was the billion-dollar question for international lawyers.
Yeah?
They aren't soldiers of a state, they don't wear identifiable uniforms, and they certainly don't represent a recognized sovereign country.
But they are highly organized, and they are definitely fighting a war.
So the massive debate over transnational non-state actors began. Are they just international criminals? Are they actual soldiers?
The U.S. government started using the term unlawful combatants around here, right?
Yes. It was a completely new, legal gray zone, created specifically to argue that these captured fighters didn't deserve full POW status under the Third Geneva Convention.
And this naturally leads to a very, very tricky legal concept called direct participation in hostilities.
This is honestly the hardest part of modern IHL to apply practically on the ground, because the general golden rule is civilians are always protected. You cannot shoot them unless they directly participate in hostilities.
So a civilian is protected right up until they aren't.
Correct. The ICRC had to issue extensive guidance in 2009 just to try and clarify what this actually meant. The basic idea is if a civilian picks up a gun and starts shooting at troops, they lose their civilian protection. They become a lawful military target.
But what if they drop the gun an hour later and go home to have dinner with their family?
That is known as the revolving door problem.
The revolving door.
Can you be a lawful target only while you are actively holding the gun and shooting? Or does your quiet membership in the insurgent group make you a valid target 24/7?
I can see how militaries would want the latter.
They did.
Yeah.
The U.S. largely took the view that if you are a confirmed member of the organized armed group, you are a target all the time, day or night. The ICRC view was much narrower. They argued you are a target only for the specific duration of your active participation.
I can see why this is just an absolute nightmare for a 19-year-old soldier on the ground. In a complex insurgency, where fighters don't wear uniforms and easily hide their weapons among the populace, distinguishing between a peaceful civilian and a direct participant must be incredibly difficult.
It's nearly impossible sometimes, and the margin for error is literally life or death. If you shoot too soon, you might commit a war crime. If you hesitate to figure out their legal status, you or your squad might die.
It's the clarity of the Geneva lecture hall crashing headfirst into the fog of war.
Perfectly said. A person standing on a roof with a radio could be actively calling in an airstrike on your position, making them a target, or they could literally just be calling their mother.
And speaking of the fog of war, we are now moving entirely into the future, the frontier of law.
Cyber, AI, and urban war.
Let's start with cyber warfare, because all these Geneva Conventions, they were written for kinetic war. Bombs, bullets, tanks, shrapnel. How on earth do they apply to invisible lines of computer code?
That is the most pressing question for military lawyers right now. If a state hacker infiltrates a power grid and shuts it down, they haven't physically blown up anything. Right.
The people might die in the local hospitals when the ventilators lose power. Is that an attack under IHL?
Most of the experts in the sources seem to think so, right?
Yes. The Talon Manual, which is the key academic study on this exact issue, says yes. It argues very clearly that if the effects of the cyber operation are comparable to a kinetic attack, meaning it causes death, injury, or physical destruction of infrastructure, then the established rules of war apply.
So those old principles of distinction and proportionality we talked about, they apply to guys behind keyboards.
They absolutely have to. You cannot launch a massive cyber attack that indiscriminately cripples civilian water treatment plants just to annoy the enemy military. The law follows the physical effect of the action, not the specific method used.
You can't just unleash a computer virus that eats everything in its path.
Exactly. Then we have autonomous weapons systems, AWS.
Or, as the media always calls them, killer robots.
This is perhaps the most profound ethical and legal challenge we have ever faced in warfare. The rapid rise of AI and robotics.
And the core debate here is about whether a machine, basically just an algorithm, can ever actually make the nuanced decisions that IHL requires.
Right, because IHL requires deeply subjective human judgments. Is this specific attack proportional? Is that enemy soldier genuinely surrendering? Or is it a trick? Is the anticipated civilian harm excessive?
These aren't just simple math problems.
No, they are complex moral and value judgments.
Can an algorithm have a conscience? Can a machine truly understand the concept of humanity?
The sources suggest there is very deep skepticism across the board here. Because if a fully autonomous robot commits a war crime, Who exactly do you prosecute at the ICC?
Right. Who goes to jail?
The robot.
The robot. The programmer in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
The military commander who just switched it on.
It creates this massive accountability vacuum.
It does. And that's exactly why there is such a strong international push right now for ensuring meaningful human control over all lethal weapons systems. We simply do not want the algorithm making the final kill decision. Meanwhile, as we worry about these futuristic robots, the reality of war today is becoming increasingly urban.
The urbanization of warfare. We see this constantly on the news. In Syria, in Gaza, in Ukraine, wars are largely not being fought in open fields anymore. They're being fought street by street in cities.
Densely populated civilian areas.
And this brings up the massive issue of explosive weapons with wide area effects. Think heavy artillery, large mortars, multi-barrel rocket launchers.
Weapons designed to just saturate a massive area with explosives.
Right, if you drop a massive 2,000-pound bomb in a dense city center, even if you are aiming perfectly at a legitimate military target, the massive blast radius will inevitably hit civilians.
And the secondary destruction of infrastructure, the water pipes, the electrical grid that affects millions of people long after the blast.
There is a growing movement globally to heavily restrict the use of these heavy explosive weapons in populated areas, precisely because the collateral damage is so predictably high that it really strains the whole definition of proportionality.
It forces us to ask, is it ever actually legal to use unguided, heavy artillery in the middle of a city?
Many would argue it isn't. Finally, in this frontier section, we have the nuclear weapons ban of 2017.
This one entered into force recently, right, in 2021?
Yes. It officially declares nuclear weapons totally illegal under international law for the states that ratify it.
Based entirely on the argument that they are inherently indiscriminate weapons.
Exactly. You physically cannot drop a nuclear weapon on a military base without fatally radiating the surrounding civilian population for miles. It's impossible. Therefore, under a strict interpretation of IHL, they are inherently illegal.
Of course, the actual nuclear powers, the U.S., Russia, China, they haven't signed it.
They haven't. But the treaty sets a powerful normative standard globally. It stigmatizes the weapon itself.
So, stepping back, what does this all mean? We've gone from 1945 basically just trying to protect wounded soldiers to today, where we are trying to protect computer data and ban autonomous robots.
It's a fascinating synthesis of incredible progress and terrifying peril.
On one hand, looking at this whole timeline, I really want to say, look at the progress we've made.
And you really should. The framework for accountability is undeniably stronger today and at any point in human history. We actually have permanent international courts. We have universal jurisdiction concepts. We have binding treaties protecting culture, protecting civilians, and banning some of the most horrific weapons ever conceived.
The impunity gap is definitely closing.
It is.
But violations still happen every single day. We see them on the news constantly. Hospitals bombed, civilians targeted.
They do. Law is not a magic wand. Writing words on a piece of paper in Geneva doesn't physically stop a bullet in flight. But what it does is provide a yardstick. It allows the global community to point and say, this is wrong. And increasingly, it allows us to say, you will eventually pay for this.
It basically turns war from a chaotic natural disaster into a regulated human activity where choices actually matter.
Precisely. It denies the aggressor the historical legitimacy of just shrugging and saying, well, war is just hell. It says, no, war is a heavily regulated legal state, and you specifically broke the law.
That is a remarkably powerful shift in human history.
It truly is.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with one final, slightly provocative thought based on the sources. We talked a lot about AI and the immense difficulty of coding ethics.
Yes, the killer robots issue.
As we inevitably move toward fully autonomous warfare, is there a chance that IHL eventually stops being a legal code for humans, for judges, lawyers, and generals, and instead literally becomes lines of computer code, like hard-coded ethics for machines?
That is the ultimate question facing the future of war. If we literally hard-code the Geneva Conventions into the targeting software of a drone, do we trust the programmers in a lab more than we trust a stressed-out, exhausted 19-year-old soldier in the field?
And if that code has a bug in it, is that a literal war crime?
That is definitely something for you listeners to mull over tonight.
Indeed. Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time. Oh, wait, hold on.
Yeah.
I feel like we have so much more to dig into here. We just gave the broad overview, but the devil in the salvation really is in the historical details. I want to go back to Section 1 for a moment if we can.
Sure. The 1949 Geneva Conventions.
Yeah. Oh, we listed them off, but I don't think we really captured the atmosphere of exactly why they were written that way.
That's a very fair point. You really have to remember, 1949 wasn't just a post-war administrative update. It was the dawn of a terrifying new realization about human vulnerability. The old 1929 conventions, they were entirely focused on the combatants.
Right.
They basically assumed that if you kept the professional soldiers fighting by a strict set of rules, the civilian population would be mostly okay sitting on the sidelines.
Right. That very old romanticized idea of war as a formal duel between two professional armies.
And World War II just completely shattered that myth forever. The city itself became the battlefield. The civilian became the primary target for terror bombing. So when the diplomats sat down in 1949 specifically to write that fourth convention, it wasn't just a legal update. It was a desperate, urgent attempt to build a legal wall around the innocent.
And that fourth convention protects civilians in occupied territories. Can we clarify that specific term? Does it protect civilians in their own country from their own government?
In 1949, no. And that is the crucial distinction to understand. The Fourth Convention protects you only if you find yourself in the hands of a foreign power, an occupier or an enemy state.
So it wouldn't have applied to Germany before the war.
Exactly. It did not legally protect German Jews from their own Nazi government in 1938, but it would have protected French civilians from the Nazi occupation in 1940.
That is a massive distinction. So even in 1949, after all that horror, state sovereignty was still king. You still couldn't tell a sovereign government how to treat its own people.
Exactly. And that's exactly why Common Article 3 was such a radical, unbelievable departure from the norm. It was the very first crack in that absolute shield of state sovereignty. It said, even if it's your own internal civil war, you cannot torture people.
It was the seed.
It was the legal seed that eventually grew into the entire modern international human rights movement.
That connects so perfectly to Section 2 and the guerrilla problem. You mentioned the gap in the law earlier. Let's really visualize this for the listeners. They get how impossible this was.
Sure. Imagine a French soldier deployed in Indochina or Algeria in the late 1950s.
Yeah.
He's been strictly trained with the brand new 1949 Geneva Conventions.
He knows the rules.
He knows them. He is looking for an enemy wearing a uniform. He is looking for a clearly marked, distinct military base to attack.
But he doesn't find one anywhere.
No. He marches into a dense jungle and finds a village. And in that village, there are just everyday rice farmers. But at night, some of those very same farmers might go out and plant a deadly roadside bomb.
So the uniformed soldier feels like the Geneva rules simply don't apply because the enemy isn't playing by them at all.
Exactly. The regular soldier says, well, they aren't wearing uniforms, they aren't carrying your weapons openly, so they're just illegal bandits. I can do whatever I want to them.
And the guerrilla fighter?
The guerrilla says, I can't possibly wear a uniform because your army has total air superiority. If I put on a uniform, I die instantly. My invisibility is literally my only defense against your technology.
So you have a total catastrophic breakdown of the reciprocity of the law.
Yes, both sides feel totally justified in ignoring the rules. And that's exactly what the 1977 additional protocols desperately tried to fix. They tried to bridge that impossible gap.
How?
I essentially offered a deal to the guerrilla fighter and said, okay, we know you can't wear a uniform 24/7, but you must carry your arms openly during the actual military engagement and during the deployment preceding it.
That seems like a very pragmatic compromise. Just show us your gun right before you shoot and we'll legally treat you like a proper soldier.
It was an incredibly controversial compromise. Many established, powerful militaries absolutely hated it. They felt it legally legitimized terrorists.
But the humanitarian argument won out.
The humanitarian argument was simple pragmatism. If we don't give these rebel fighters a legal incentive to follow at least some basic rules, they will just follow no rules at all.
It's always about the carrot and the stick in international law, isn't it?
Exactly. IHL is constantly trying to give fighters a selfish incentive to be humane. Treat our captured guys well. And we promise we'll treat your captured guys well.
Let's jump forward to the weapons bans in Section 3 again. The 1980 CCW, blinding laser weapons. I still feel like this is a terrifying sci-fi horror movie that we somehow narrowly avoided.
It really is.
Yeah.
The technology was absolutely there. Major militaries were actively developing powerful lasers that could just sweep silently across a battlefield and instantly burn out the retinas of anyone looking in that general direction.
I mean, logically speaking, why is that legally considered worse than just shooting someone with a bullet? I mean, dead is dead, right?
That is the core philosophical debate in weapons law. But the legal consensus was that blinding a person constitutes a superfluous injury.
superfluous injury.
Yes, it causes permanent, lifelong, horrific suffering that serves no actual military purpose beyond initially disabling the enemy. You can effectively disable the enemy without blinding them permanently for the rest of their natural life.
It goes back to that core Geneva principle of unnecessary suffering.
Yes. The only legitimate goal of war, legally speaking, is to weaken the military forces of the enemy. It is not to inflict maximum possible pain on the individual human beings.
That distinction is so incredibly subtle, but it's so important. You shoot them to stop them, not to punish them.
Correct. And blinding lasers were seen essentially as a form of torture at a distance. So they were banned preemptively. It's actually one of the very few times in human history that humanity successfully banned a weapon before it was ever used in mass combat.
That actually gives me a little bit of hope for the future.
Definitely should. It proves we can be proactive.
Now, the Landmine Treaty. Ottawa, 1997. You mentioned the civil society aspect earlier. I really want to drill down on how incredibly unique that was in the history of diplomacy.
It was unprecedented.
Yeah.
Usually, as we said, arms control is discussed in quiet, boring rooms in Geneva by guys with stars on their shoulders. But this time, it was discussed in public town halls by local doctors, amputee victims, and loud campaigners.
They made it impossible to ignore.
The international campaign to ban landmines brilliantly used the global media to show the actual reality. They show the legless children in Cambodia and Angola.
They just bypassed the military gatekeepers entirely.
They did. They went straight to the elected politicians and the voting public. They made it a purely moral issue, not a tactical military one. They actively shamed democratic governments into signing it.
And the core legal argument was that the immediate military utility of the mine, slowing down the enemy advance, was totally outweighed by the long-term humanitarian cost.
It was the proportionality calculation applied on a global, multi-decade scale. They successfully argued that a weapon that indiscriminately kills civilian farmers 30 years after a war officially ends is inherently always disproportionate.
Moving back to Section 4 in the ICC, we talked about complementarity, but let's talk practically about who the ICC actually targets. We said leaders.
Yes. The ICC mandate strictly focuses on those bearing the greatest responsibility. They aren't interested in prosecuting the private soldier who steals a watch or shoots one prisoner. They're interested in the general who officially ordered the entire village burned, or the president who actively incited the radio hate speech.
This is incredibly difficult to prove in court, though, isn't it? Because often the order to commit a war crime isn't formally written down on a nice piece of paper.
It's unbelievably difficult. That's exactly why these ICC trials take years and years. The prosecutors have to meticulously build a chain of command case. They have to definitively prove that the senior leader either knew or absolutely should have known what his frontline troops were doing, and that he completely failed to take action to stop it.
The doctrine of command responsibility.
Exactly. You cannot just claim blissful ignorance if you are the one in charge. If your troops are committing systematic rape or mass murder, and you do absolutely nothing to punish them, you are personally, criminally liable.
And the ICC has faced a lot of intense criticism over the years, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A tremendous amount. Some of the world's major powers, like the U.S., Russia, China, they are not members of the Rome Statute. This severely limits the court's global reach. It can't just go anywhere it wants.
It has jurisdictional limits.
It generally has jurisdiction only if the alleged crime happens on the physical territory of a member state, or if the accused person is a national of a member state.
Or, as you mentioned, if the UN Security Council specifically refers a case to them.
Right. But that is incredibly rare because of the veto power held by the permanent members. So yes, the ICC is a very flawed, politically constrained institution, but it is still the only permanent international criminal court we have.
Let's loop back to the War on Terror era in Section 5, the direct participation dilemma. I'm still thinking about the visual you described earlier, the terrifying difficulty of distinguishing who is a target.
Let's look at that 2009 ICRC guidance again to see how they tried to solve it. They tried to create a workable legal standard for soldiers. They said that to be considered directly participating, a civilian's action needs to meet 3 cumulative requirements.
Okay, what are they?
First, a threshold of harm, meaning you're doing something objectively dangerous to the enemy. Second, direct causation. Your specific action directly causes the military harm. And third, belligerent nexus, meaning you're doing it specifically to help one side win the war.
Okay, that sounds very technical and lawyerly. Give me a concrete example.
Okay, if a civilian decides to drive an ammunition truck right up to the front line during a firefight.
Let's test it. Threshold of harm. Yes, supplying ammo is dangerous, direct causation. Yes, those bullets will be fired immediately. Belligerent nexus. Yes, he's clearly trying to help his side win.
Exactly. He meets all three criteria. He is actively participating. He is a lawful target while driving that truck.
Okay. What if a civilian baker just sells regular food to the local soldiers?
Let's test it. Threshold of harm. Not really. Causation. Very indirect. He is sustaining the soldiers biologically, but not sustaining the actual fighting specifically. He is likely not a lawful target.
What if a civilian acts as an unarmed lookout? They just stand on a corner and yell, "Hey, the enemy patrol is coming."
Under the guidance, that is direct participation. Tactical information is a potent weapon in urban combat.
Wow, so a random person standing there with a cell phone can legally be classified as a combatant.
In modern warfare, absolutely. If that cell phone is actively being used to call in an artillery strike on your position, that person is a deadly threat and a lawful target.
And this leads right back into cyber warfare, doesn't it? Because the lookout might not be on a street corner. They might be 3,000 miles away behind a computer keyboard.
Exactly. The Talon Manual experts wrestled endlessly with this scenario. If a civilian hacker sitting in a coffee shop creates a critical software vulnerability that their military then exploits to launch a missile, is that civilian hacker a lawful military target?
It completely blurs the geographical lines of war. The battlefield is literally everywhere now.
And that is absolutely terrifying for the foundational concept of protecting civilians. Because if the battlefield is everywhere, then the civilians are constantly standing in the middle of the battlefield.
Let's go a bit deeper into the urbanization aspect in Section 6. The sources repeatedly mention explosive weapons with wide area effects.
We're talking about things like unguided artillery shells, heavy mortars, multi-barrel rocket launchers. These are weapons that were originally designed for fighting tank battles on the open plains of Europe during the Cold War.
Designed to stop massive tank columns in a field.
Right. When you fire a massive grad rocket into a dense city block today, you cannot possibly control exactly which apartment building it lands on. And even if it miraculously hits the exact building with the enemy sniper on the roof, the concussive blast wave shatters windows and collapses walls for 100 meters in every direction.
So the legal argument is that using these specific weapons in the city is, by definition, violating the fundamental rule of distinction.
Many major humanitarian organizations forcefully argue exactly that. They say you simply cannot use them in a populated city while complying with IHL.
But the militaries disagree.
Militaries fiercely argue that they absolutely need them to fight entrenched enemies in cities. It's a massive, unresolved, ongoing global debate.
And looking finally at the nuclear ban treaty again, it really just seems entirely symbolic if the countries with the nukes refuse to sign it.
It is deeply symbolic, yes. But symbols have immense power in international law. It stigmatizes the weapon. It shifts the global diplomatic narrative from nuclear weapons are a prestigious guarantee of national security to nuclear weapons are an illegal, indiscriminate abomination.
And over time, that kind of normative pressure can actually change state policy.
Exactly. Just like it did with landmines. The U.S. hasn't officially signed the Ottawa Landmine Treaty either, but it largely abides by its terms in practice now. The global stigma works.
Before we truly close out today, I want to revisit your final thought about the code. If we have autonomous weapon systems, these killer robots who actually decides the numerical threshold for acceptable civilian casualties.
That is the most chilling part of all of this. In the targeting software of that machine, there will literally have to be a program variable. Acceptable collateral damage equals X.
Oh my God.
Someone, somewhere in a lab, has to type a number into that variable. Is it 0? Is it 1? Is it 10 civilians?
In a human brain, like a commander on the ground, that's a complex, agonizing, context-dependent moral calculus made in the heat of the moment. But in a machine, it's just a fixed setting.
It's just a setting. And if you set it rigidly to 0, the machine might never actually fire its weapon, rendering it useless. But if you set it to 10, it might routinely commit war crimes without hesitation.
And can a machine ever understand the subtle human difference between an injured soldier desperately trying to surrender and a soldier faking an injury to set a lethal trap?
Human soldiers barely understand that difference in the heat of combat. Expecting a camera lens and a silicon algorithm to flawlessly detect the nuance of human intent, that is an incredibly tall order.
The sources constantly mention that IHL requires subjective human judgment. Can AI ever truly be subjective?
By its very definition, no. AI is fundamentally objective. It follows its programmed rules. But mercy on the battlefield is not a rule. Mercy is a human exception to the rule. Can you write a line of code for mercy?
That is a genuinely profound thought. Can you code mercy?
If we can't, then perhaps we really shouldn't be delegating the ultimate power of life and death to unfeeling machines.
This deep dive has really shown me that the rules of war are not static, dusty texts. They are a constant, desperate chase.
A permanent race between our immense technological capacity for destruction and our moral capacity for restraint.
From the ashes of Nuremberg to the digital cloud.
And the race isn't over yet. Not even close.
It certainly isn't. Listeners, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, from the 4 Geneva Conventions to the ethical void of artificial intelligence.
We've seen exactly how IHL strives to protect the vulnerable, the wounded, the shipwrecked, the POWs, and the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire.
We've seen how it clumsily but earnestly tried to adapt to guerrillas and civil wars with the 1977 protocols.
How it successfully banned the horrific, the lasers, the landmines, the chemical weapons.
How it built a permanent court system to punish the guilty leaders.
And how it is struggling right now to firmly keep the human in the loop of modern digital warfare.
It's a lot to process, but if there's one single takeaway from all these sources, it's that these rules absolutely matter. They are the very thin red line between organized war and total unhinged barbarism.
They are the enduring proof that even in our absolute darkest moments as a species, we still try to hold on to our basic humanity.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking those hard questions.
And always keep reading the fine print.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are going to be stripping away the politics and the rhetoric to really look at the machinery under the hood of modern conflict. We're asking a question that, it sounds abstract, but it is actually a matter of life and death.
Right, and it is the uncomfortable question that no one really wants to answer. In a world of autonomous drones, cyber attacks that can instantly shut down hospitals, and fighters who simply don't wear uniforms, does the rulebook still work?
Exactly. Is International Humanitarian Law, IHL, still a functioning shield, or has it become essentially a relic of a bygone era? And for my part, I take the position that IHL is actually a robust, living framework. It is not just ink on paper from 1949. It is successfully adapted to every historical pivot point, and it remains the only thing standing between war and total barbarism.
And I come at it from a very different perspective. I argue that we are deluding ourselves. While the laws look pristine in a textbook, the changing nature of conflict, specifically asymmetric warfare, and the explosion of technology has totally outpaced the legal architecture. We are essentially bringing a paper shield to a drone fight.
Well, let's get right into it then. And I want to start by challenging this idea that the law is somehow outpaced. Because if you look at the history, the evolution of IHL is actually this incredible success story of adaptation. I mean, we aren't using the same rules we used for trench warfare in 1914.
Well, no, but we are using the rules from 1949, essentially.
But think about why we have those rules. After World War II, the world looked at the ashes of Europe and Asia and realized the old laws, the 1929 codes, had utterly failed. They failed to stop the Holocaust. They failed to stop the mass slaughter of civilians. So 1949 wasn't just an update, it was a revolution. The Geneva Conventions became the bedrock of modern warfare.
Bedrock is a very romantic word for a system designed for a world that has completely vanished.
But look at what it achieved. For the first time, we had 4 conventions that didn't just protect soldiers. The 4th convention specifically protected civilians in occupied territories. That was a massive leap forward. And, when the world shifted again, when we moved into the 60s and 70s with wars of national liberation, the law didn't break. It adapted. We got the 1977 additional protocols.
Okay, let's pause on 1977 because I think you're reading that as a victory, and I read it as a panic attack.
How so?
You frame the 1977 protocols as this great, thoughtful evolution. I see it as the law realizing it had lost the plot. The 1949 conventions were built for very clear binaries. Good guys in green, bad guys in gray, fighting in a muddy field far away from grandma's house. But by the 70s, you had Vietnam, you had Algeria. The traditional battlefield was gone. It was fighters in the living room. The 1977 protocols were just the law desperately trying to follow the fighter into the city.
Isn't that exactly what a robust system does? It saw a gap, this merging of the soldier and the civilian, and it filled it. It merged the law of Geneva, which is about protecting victims, with the law of Hague, which is about how you are actually allowed to kill. It acknowledged that you can't always separate the target from the population anymore, so it created much stricter rules on targeting.
It created complex rules. And complexity in war is a recipe for failure. The entire logic of IHL rests on the principle of distinction. You have to be able to tell the difference between a combatant and a civilian. In 1949, you just looked for a uniform. Easy. Today, you have a farmer in a village who picks up a radio to call in a mortar strike and then just goes back to farming. Is he a civilian? Is he a combatant? The law is incredibly murky here.
It is actually not murky at all. The law has a very specific answer for that farmer.
Which is?
Direct participation in hostilities. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, issued clear guidance on this. That farmer loses his civilian protection for such time as he is directly participating. When he is on the radio calling in the strike, he is a valid target. When he puts the radio down, he's a civilian again. It's a revolving door of protection.
A revolving door? That is exactly my point. You expect a 19-year-old sergeant on the ground or a drone pilot 5,000 miles away to make a split-second legal judgment about whether the guy holding the shovel was holding a radio 10 minutes ago? That isn't a living framework. That is an impossible standard. The binary of civilian versus soldier has totally collapsed. We have non-state actors, transnational groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, who recognize no law, fighting inside densely populated cities. The law is trying to apply a duel's code of honor to a bar fight.
I think you're selling the architecture short. You are focusing on the difficulty of application, which I admit is very real, but you are ignoring the safety net. Even in the messiest civil war, we have common Article 3.
Ah, the mini convention.
Exactly. It is a set of fundamental rights embedded in the 1949 conventions that applies to everyone, specifically in non-international armed conflicts. It basically says, okay, maybe you aren't a state army, maybe you don't have a flag, but you still cannot torture, you cannot execute prisoners, you cannot take hostages. This applies to rebels, insurgents, everyone.
And do the rebels know that? Does a warlord in a failed state actually care about common Article 3?
Whether they care or not doesn't change the legal fact that they are bound by it. And this brings up the 2005 customary international law study. The ICRC went through and said, look, even if a country hasn't signed the specific treaty, these rules are so universal, they are now custom. They are binding on everyone. The system self-corrects by solidifying these norms over time.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that custom is enough to hold back the tide. It brings us to the elephant in the room, which is enforcement. You can have the most beautiful, intricate customary law in the world, but if there are no handcuffs at the end of it, they are just polite suggestions.
But we do have the handcuffs. We are living in the age of accountability. This is the biggest shift in the last 50 years. We move from the Nuremberg precedent, which established that individuals, not just abstract states, are criminally liable, all the way to the creation of the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
The ICC is a symbol, certainly, but is it an effective enforcer?
It is much more than a symbol. It's the first permanent international court with jurisdiction over genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And before the ICC, look at the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. These weren't just show trials. They literally changed the definitions of reality. They established that sexual violence isn't just some tragic byproduct of war, it is a weapon of war, and it's a crime against humanity. That simply didn't exist in the legal consciousness before. Now a general can go to jail for it.
That is a compelling argument, and I definitely won't deny the historical importance of the Rwanda Tribunal. But let's look at the ICC specifically. There is a massive catch that limits its power in the real world. It's called complementarity.
Right, which respects national sovereignty.
Or to put it in plain English for our listeners, the ICC is the backup goalie. It is not allowed to step onto the field unless the national courts completely collapse or simply refuse to play. If a state says, "Don't worry, we are investigating ourselves," the ICC has to sit on the bench.
That is a feature, not a bug. We want nations to prosecute their own war criminals. The ICC is the safety valve. If a state is genuinely unwilling or unable to prosecute, then the court steps in.
But that leaves enforcement largely dependent on the very states committing the violations. It turns the ICC into an umpire that can only make a call if the teams agree to let him on the field. If a major global power or an ally of a major power commits a war crime, the political pressure makes the ICC toothless. That is why we see this recurring accusation that it only prosecutes specific types of defendants from specific regions. The law might be universal, but the enforcement is deeply political.
It is not perfect, I will certainly grant you that. But compare it to the alternative. Before this framework, there was total impunity. Now, even heads of state have to look over their shoulder. And enforcement isn't just about jail time, it is about stigmatization. Look at weapons bans.
You mean landmines?
I do. The 1997 Ottawa Treaty. Anti-personnel landmines were devastating civilians for decades. The international community came together and banned them. Or the Chemical Weapons Convention. These are tangible proofs that when weapons are deemed inherently indiscriminate, the law can effectively eliminate them.
And I absolutely applaud the Ottawa Treaty. Banning a physical landmine, a chunk of metal and explosive, is a great achievement. But that is the easy stuff. That is 20th century thinking. We're moving into an era where the weapons aren't physical or even human.
You were talking about cyber.
I am talking about cyber warfare and autonomous weapons. This is where your living framework hits a brick wall. The 1949 Geneva Conventions are predicated on kinetic violence, physical force. How do you apply distinction and proportionality to a line of code?
The principles remain exactly the same. The tool changes, but the rule doesn't.
Okay, let's play that out. IHL says you cannot attack civilian objects, but in the cyber domain, everything is dual use. Let's say a military is using a civilian server to route their communications. If you launch a cyber attack to wipe that server, and it also wipes the records of a bank or a hospital that was sharing the cloud space, is that an attack? No one died, no glass was broken, but you have crippled a civilian institution.
It is absolutely an attack, and the legal community is already coalescing around this. Look at the Talon Manual. It is a massive study by legal and technical experts figuring out exactly this problem. The consensus is that it is not about the means, it is about the consequences. If a cyber operation causes injury, death, or significant physical damage or functionality loss, it is a use of force. If you hack a dam and open the floodgates, that is a weapon. The law covers it.
Functionality loss is a slippery slope, though. If I just slow down the internet in an enemy city to stop their propaganda, is that a war crime? The definitions are incredibly fuzzy. But let's escalate this, because cyber is one thing. The real existential crisis for IHL is AI, autonomous weapon systems, killer robots.
Right, the Terminator scenario.
It sounds like sci-fi, but it is here right now. Loitering munitions that can pick their own targets. Here is the fundamental problem. IHL requires subjective human judgment. The principles of distinction and proportionality require a commander to look at a target and ask, is the military advantage of blowing up this building worth the cost of the 3 civilian families living next door? That is an ethical, moral calculation. Can an algorithm make a moral choice?
That is the core debate of our time. But I would argue that an algorithm might actually be better at it than a human. Humans panic, humans get angry, humans want revenge. A machine doesn't get tired or scared. If we program the rules of engagement correctly, an autonomous system might actually reduce civilian casualties because it will only fire when the probability of a match is 99.9%.
But who is responsible when it is wrong?
What do you mean?
Let's say we deploy this perfect AI drone. It enters a combat zone. It sees a group of people holding long, dark objects. The algorithm identifies them as rifles. It fires. Turns out, they were refugees carrying 10 poles. A total tragedy. A war crime, potentially. Who goes to jail?
The commander who deployed it?
But the commander didn't pull the trigger. The commander didn't even know the drone was looking at that specific group. The programmer in Silicon Valley didn't intend for it to kill refugees. In criminal law, we have this concept of mens rea, the guilty mind. You have to intend to commit the crime. With AI, there is no guilty mind. There is just a black box of code. You have created a loop of total impunity.
That is a legitimate fear, I admit, the accountability gap.
But that is exactly why many states in the ISRC are heavily pushing for a requirement of meaningful human control. You cannot just wind up the robot and let it go. There must be a human in the loop.
But the speed of war is getting too fast for humans. If you have a human in the loop, you lose the advantage to the enemy who lets their AI decide in milliseconds. The pressure to take the human out of the loop will be overwhelming.
Then the law will ban it. Look at the 2021 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It is based on the idea that some weapons are just too dangerous to exist. The legal trend is always toward restriction. If a weapon cannot distinguish between a soldier and a civilian, it is illegal, period. Whether it is a biological virus or a computer virus or a robot, we don't necessarily need new laws to say that indiscriminate killing is wrong. We just need to rigorously apply the ones we have.
I admire your faith in the system. I really do. But while we debate the hypothetical future of AI, I want to bring us back down to the mud. The physical reality of modern war is already breaking the system, even without robots. Look at the urbanization of warfare. Gaza, Ukraine, Syria, Mosul.
It is horrific.
It is not just horrific, it is structural. The Geneva Conventions were designed for armies fighting in fields. Today, war is happening in dense urban centers. When you use wide area explosive weapons, artillery, rockets in a densely populated city, the law of proportionality becomes a math problem that always equals 0 for the civilian. The blast radius doesn't care about your legal distinctions. Concrete dust chokes everyone equally. The very geography of the war guarantees massive harm.
That is true. Urban war is an absolute nightmare. But this is exactly my point about the law being a shield. Without IHL, without the Geneva Conventions, there is no restraints at all. A commander could just carpet bomb the entire city and say, well, that's war.
Some would argue that is exactly what is happening even with the law in place.
But because of the law, we have the vocabulary to call it a crime. We can investigate it. We can condemn it. Without these rules, there's only vae victis, woe to the vanquished. The evolution of IHL from 1949 to the ICC creates a clear trajectory. It is an expanding circle of protection and a narrowing tolerance for impunity. It is imperfect, yes. It is often violated, yes. But it is the only barrier between war and absolute hell.
I accept that it provides a baseline, a vocabulary, as you said. But my primary concern is that we are relying on a barrier that is absolutely full of holes. The complexity of asymmetric conflict, the transnational nature of terror groups, and the dehumanization inherent in AI weapons challenge the very foundation of the law. The law is reactive. It often arrives on the scene with a briefcase and a judge 10 years after the atrocity has occurred. We need to critically acknowledge that for the wars of tomorrow, the current bedrock might be crumbling.
Will never be fully resolved. But the fact that we're even having this debate that states are forced to justify their actions in the language of law proves its power.
It proves its existence. Whether it proves its efficacy, well, that is what the listeners will have to decide for themselves. Are we truly safe behind this framework, or do we urgently need a new Geneva Convention for the age of AI?
That is indeed the question we leave you with today. Thank you for joining the debate.